The numbers coming out of the World Health Organization and Alzheimer's Disease International are staggering. We are looking at a projected jump from 57 million people living with dementia globally to over 152 million by the year 2050.
It is a massive demographic shift, and the sheer scale of it forces us to look at how we are actually handling cognitive decline. Right now, the global landscape of cognitive impairment is defined by this really profound tension. On one side, you have the clinical imperative to manage a disease, and on the other, you have the human necessity to preserve a life. The limitations of a purely medicalized framework have moved from being a theoretical concern to an urgent social crisis. We are treating a biological reality, but we are often missing the human being sitting right in front of us.
There's a story that perfectly captures this tension. Jeremy S. Watkins, the founder of Curiosity, a home care provider in Virginia, calls it the Sunday-Monday problem. A caregiver has a client who wakes up agitated, demanding to go to church because she thinks it's Sunday. The caregiver reminds her it's Monday, argument ensues, total confusion, but later that afternoon, the client's daughter calls, and suddenly the client is entirely lucid, knows the daughter's name, asks about work. The second the call ends, the confusion returns.
That exact scenario is the crux of the issue. The medical model calls that show timing or an anomaly. It writes it off as the unpredictable nature of a broken brain. But Watkins argues, and the science backs this up, that it is not an act. The daughter's functioning as a mental landmark. The person with dementia is in a constant state of cognitive fog, lost in a place where nothing is familiar. They are desperately searching for a fixed point, a lighthouse. When they hear the daughter's voice, they find their footing. They find their sense of self. It is navigation, not faking it.
That reframes the entire approach to care. We move from correcting facts to connecting with feelings.
Precisely. If we are going to actually embrace person-centered care, which is a term everyone uses but very few people actually operationalize, we have to change our own system of thinking. We blame the system for poor dementia care, but we are the system. Every decision needs to be based on the individuals involved, not just seeing someone as a care recipient. We have to map their memories, their preferences, the relational depth of their family. We have to map what remains instead of constantly measuring what is lost. And to do that, we have to understand why we became so obsessed with measuring the loss in the first place.
Which takes us back to 1901, Frankfurt, Germany. A 51-year-old woman named Auguste Detter is brought to an asylum by her husband.
Right, and this is the foundational moment for how we view dementia today. Auguste was terrified. She famously told her doctor, Alois Alzheimer, "I have lost myself," so to say. For over a century, the dominant narrative of dementia has been one of loss and deterioration, based on this case. Before Dr. Alzheimer, severe cognitive decline was just written off as senility, a moral failure, or just the natural fading of old age. The medical establishment essentially shrugged its shoulders.
Dr. Alzheimer put a slice of her brain under a microscope after she died and found plaques and tangles. He gave us the broken brain model.
He did, and it was a revolutionary shift. It destroyed the useless myth that senility and gave families a scientific answer. It proved this was a physical, measurable disease. But while this medicalization provided a vital framework for research, it also initiated a century of clinical reductionism. The personhood of the individual became obscured by the pathology of the brain. The broken brain model is incredibly good at telling us what is destroyed, but it is terrible at explaining what remains. It cannot explain the Sunday-Monday problem. It cannot explain how someone who cannot find their own bedroom can sit at a piano and flawlessly play a concerto.
Because it's a map of deficits. We are looking at the burned out bridges and missing the past that are still intact.
Exactly. Sociological critiques of the medical model argue that it creates a dichotomy between disease
and illness. The disease is defined by biomarkers and proteinopathy. The illness is the person's lived experience of disabling forgetfulness. By leaning exclusively into technical disease definitions, the current system alienates individuals from their own conditions. When care is framed solely as a medical intervention, we risk falling into what Tom Kitwood termed malignant social psychology. We infantilize people, we talk over them, we treat them as diseased minds, rather than human beings participating in an equal interaction.
That mistreatment is often more damaging than the neurocognitive degeneration itself.
Without question, and this is why there is a push to adopt the social model of disability for dementia. In this framework, the disability is not located solely within the individual's brain. It is produced by a society that fails to provide the necessary cues, supports, and physical environments to accommodate cognitive impairment. A person may have a cognitive impairment, but they are disabled by the way they are excluded from society.
I hear you, but I keep getting stuck on applying the social model to dementia. A wheelchair ramp fixes stairs. Closed captions fix audio access. What fixes a brain that is actively dying? Calling the symptoms of a progressive neurological disease a societal failure feels like a stretch.
Actually, no, the more interesting thing is that we aren't trying to fix the brain with the social model. We are trying to alter the environment so the impairment doesn't result in total social death. Think about Daniel Kahneman's dual process theory. System 2 is the slow, logical, fact-based part of the brain. That is the first to go in dementia. System 1 is the fast, emotional, instinctive part. It stays intact much longer. The current clinical system constantly tries to talk to a person's System 2. We correct their facts. We tell them it's Monday. We argue with a brain that cannot process the argument, and then we label the resulting agitation as a symptom of the disease. The societal failure is our insistence on communicating in a language they no longer speak.
So the mental landmarks philosophy targets System 1.
Yes, it leverages the ancient art of memory, specifically the method of loci, which involves using physical or mental landmarks to facilitate memorization. For a person with dementia, this isn't a memory trick. It is a survival strategy. By associating essential life tasks and emotional states with specific, vivid environmental cues, caregivers can help the individual create a safety net, and the neuroscience backs this up. Functional MRI studies show that semantic organizational strategies can activate the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral and orbitofrontal areas. The mental landmarks philosophy uses these bilateral activations to help individuals maintain a mental map of their lives.
Like break down these landmarks. Watkins categorizes them into people, place, passion, and sensory, starting with people landmarks.
The core idea here is that the heart remembers long after the brain forgets. The thinking part of the brain, the cortex and hippocampus, is like the front office. It stores facts like, Jane is my daughter. That office is damaged. But deep in the back, in the amygdala, is the emotional core. It stores feelings. It stores the feeling of safety and love associated with Jane's voice. So when a loved one asks, "Who are you?" it is not a rejection. They have lost the fact of who you are, but they still hold the feeling of you. You are a people landmark.
Which fundamentally changes the caregiver's role. We are no longer supposed to walk in and test them with, "Do you know who I am?"
Testing them is the worst thing we can do. It induces panic and shame. Our job is to walk in, sit down, and just be with them. We provide the warm, safe presence. But we have to acknowledge the devastating emotional toll this takes on the caregiver. There is a specific kind of grief here, mourning a person who is still alive. It is ambiguous loss. The psychological loop cannot be closed because the relationship is in a liminal state. What is lost is not just the person's ability to remember facts, but their ability to serve as a witness to the caregiver's own life.
The grief of the friend who is still alive.
Exactly. When a long marriage thins due to cognitive decline, The healthy partner loses a version of themselves that only existed in the other's gaze. Stephen Sabbath's work on the manifestations of selfhood is crucial here. Self 3 is the social persona, being a teacher, a mother, a friend. It is entirely contingent on other people recognizing and supporting that role. When caregivers treat the person only as a patient, they destroy that self 3. The mental landmarks approach seeks to preserve these roles by anchoring the person in their established personas.
That brings us to place landmarks, the environmental memory palace.
Right. A common failure in modern care is building sterile, placeless environments. We remove the clutter for safety, but we also remove the cues. A place landmark is a specific chair, a textured wall, or a specific view out a window that acts as a proximate course maintaining device. Research indicates people recall spatial patterns with greater accuracy in rooms filled with familiar furniture. This is why moving someone to a new environment causes such high cognitive load and agitation. Their map is gone.
And this reframes sundowning.
Sundowning isn't a magical curse that happens at 4 p.m. It is a failure of a place landmark. As the sun sets, light turns to shadow. A familiar hallway becomes menacing. The reflection in the window becomes a stranger staring back at them. The safe harbor becomes unfamiliar. We combat this not by arguing with them when they say, "I want to go home," while sitting in their own living room. We combat it by turning on lights, closing curtains, and leading them back to their anchor chair. We validate the feeling of wanting to be safe rather than arguing the coordinates of their location.
Let's pivot to passion and sensory landmarks. This is where the procedural memory and the superhighways come in.
Passion landmarks rely on the cerebellum and basal ganglia, the workshop of the brain. This is where how-to memory is stored. It's why the woman who cannot remember her daughter's name can flawlessly play the piano. That part of the brain is highly resistant to the disease. By handing a lifelong carpenter a piece of wood to sand, or handing a baker a whisk, we are anchoring them to their identity. And sensory landmarks, music and smell, are the most direct routes we have. Scent bypasses the thinking brain entirely and goes straight to the amygdala. Playing a song from their youth isn't just a nice activity. It is a neurological intervention that cuts through the fog.
So if we synthesize all this into an operational system, how does it compare to existing models? We have the Montessori-inspired lifestyle and David Sheard's butterfly household model.
Both are attempts to move away from clinical reductionism. The Montessori method emphasizes competence, purpose, and independence. It views the resident as capable and focuses on organized, task-focused environments. The butterfly model, on the other hand, operates on the premise that feelings matter most. As cognitive abilities decline, emotional intelligence often remains intact. The resident becomes a feeling being rather than a thinking being. The butterfly model demands that caregivers engage in emotional labor and cross the bridge into the resident's reality rather than fixing them with corrective facts.
Validating their reality, even if it means agreeing that their deceased parents are still alive.
Yes. And that brings up a massive hurdle in rethinking care, the scope of practice. In places like Virginia, where Jeremy Watkins operates Curiosity, professional caregivers have a strictly regulated scope to prevent the unlicensed practice of medicine. They handle personal care, bathing, meal prep, but they are bound by task-oriented care plans that often create moral distress because caregivers want to focus on the person but are limited by policy and time constraints. Meanwhile, family caregivers are forced into a shadow scope.
Families are taking on complex medical tasks with zero formal training.
Over 2/3 of family caregivers perform nursing tasks, managing injections, dysphagia diets, operating specialized equipment. This leads to a profound sense of low self-efficacy. They view these tasks as massive strains. Watkins argues that we need to rethink the family's role entirely. They shouldn't be unpaid nurses. They need to be the primary witness to the individual's humanity.
Wait, does that actually hold? Because if the family says, I'm setting a boundary, I won't do the medical tasks, who is going to do them? The professional caregivers aren't legally allowed to do many of them, and families can't afford 24/7 private RNs. Setting boundaries might be an act of love, but the physical needs of the patient don't disappear just because a boundary is set.
That is the brutal reality of the systemic failure. But the point Watkins is making in While the World Reduces Them, Care in Crisis, is that when families dissolve their own boundaries out of guilt, when they go into a fawn response just to keep the peace, they exhaust themselves to the point where they can no longer provide the relational care that only they can provide. If a daughter is entirely consumed by the trauma of performing complex toileting and wound care, she has no emotional capacity left to be the daughter. She loses the ability to be the people landmark.
So it's about scenario planning, determining intended plans before the crisis hits.
Exactly, saying the boundaries out loud before they are crossed.
And for the behavioral challenges, Watkins advocates for the PTM model: priming, timing, miming. Priming uses environmental cues to signal an activity. Timing synchronizes tasks with the person's natural rhythms. And miming uses visual and verbal modalities simultaneously to increase understanding. It recognizes that all behavior has meaning. Aggression is almost always defensive, a response to a terrifying, unrecognizable world.
We are trying to change from task-based thinking to person-centered thinking.
And that requires us to become cartographers or detectives of joy. Instead of just logging negative symptoms and behaviors, we need to map the connections. We need to document which song works, which chair brings peace, what time of day they are most lucid. We have to construct a new architecture of care. We aren't trying to fix the brain. We are trying to hold the hand of the person while they walk through the landscape of their remaining reality.
Which leads to the metaphor of the Lighthouse Keeper. A lighthouse keeper doesn't try to stop the storm. They don't argue with the wind or try to reason with the fog. The blocks and tangles are a storm we cannot command to be still. But we can keep the lights on. We can place these mental landmarks, these lighthouses in the environment to guide our loved ones. And crucially, a lighthouse keeper has to maintain the lighthouse. Self-care and self-forgiveness for the caregiver are not luxuries. If your light burns out, everyone is lost in the fog.
It forces us to look at the person, not just the disease, to see their passions, their faith, the depth of their family history.
That is the only way forward. We have prioritized care as a task over care as a relationship for a century. The mental landmarks philosophy gives the mind a map to hold on to, and it gives the caregiver a framework to protect the personhood of the individual. It's a profound shift in how we value human life at its most vulnerable.
We've been talking about the concepts outlined by Jeremy S. Watkins in While the World Reduces Them, Care in Crisis, and his work with Curiosity. It's a necessary conversation for anyone navigating this landscape.
Share this with someone who is currently in the thick of caregiving and feeling lost. These ideas need to be in the hands of the people doing the work.
This is CARECAST. Exploring the heart of care.